Hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about the experimental design that you will be probably using during your FENG projects. I'm Assistant Professor Dr. Mina Görmstein from the Department of Genetics and Bioengineering. At the end of the presentation, I will be delivering my email address. If you have any questions, you can always send me an email or send me a message through Oasis. So, our topic today is method development and design of experiments, which I believe is very important to initiate your experiments or to design your senior project. It's the first step that you should take before starting any of your planning. So I'll briefly be talking about research, the methodology that we're talking about when we mentioned experiments, hypothesis testing, and design of experiments. First of all, what is research, what is experimentation, and what are we, why are we using these techniques in order to figure out the, uh, in order to kind of understand the applications behind our hypothesis. So, to start with, research is the systematic approach to obtain and confirm new and reliable knowledge. So, throughout the research process, you have to be able to search for explanation of events, some phenomena, relationships, and causes. This can only be realized throughout a process. Observing such a system or a process while it's in operation is a very important part of the learning process and is an integral part of understanding and learning about how systems and specific processes work. So, in order to understand this, what's happening throughout your process, you have to change certain input factors, and you also have to do more than just watching what's happening throughout that process. You actually have to change your factors and keep some of them standardized or stable, and change the other factors so that you can actually understand the effects of the factors that you've changed, whether they have significant effects or whether they're insignificant. And while doing these changes to your procedure, you have to conduct some experiments on your system. So, in order to understand and see the results of your practical applications, you have to test your hypothesis with the help of experimentation. Eventually, what we need to understand is each experimental run is actually a test that you need to confirm throughout your procedure. So we can eventually define an experiment as a test or series of runs in which purposeful changes are made to the input variables of a certain process or system that you want to observe. Such as in research, as you can see here, we have completed a general definition which can be applied to all disciplines. Considering all of you are going to be engineers at the end of this year, this process can be applied to all fields of engineering together with research, experimentation, and observing all processes. And what is a methodology? So, in order to systematically apply your experimentation, you need to follow specific methodologies. The study of the general approach to the inquiry in a specific field is called the methodology, and the techniques that you use or devices, some procedures that you apply during your experimentation is called your method. And the scientific method specifically is a logical, consistent process for solving your problems in the natural world. Also, in order to perform this, you need to start with a specific research question and or hypothesis. This is what you have to be following for the first semester in this academic year, because in order to be able to plan your experimental procedure, you need to start writing your project proposal and then um, get help from your supervisor and maybe apply for a grant if you have some experimental work. So, as we mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, you have to be able to understand or observe or apply a process. And this process is a series of actions that transforms inputs to outputs. So I will choose a pen color here. What are our inputs? You can have some information, some methods, energy, depending on what kind of engineering or which field of engineering you are in, materials, some devices, people. So all of these inputs together will eventually be collaborating and then creating some outputs here. And these are all connected to each other. First operation will have an input here and will eventually give an output, and this output will be the input of this operation B, and then this will give another output, and this output will be the input of operation C, and eventually in a series of actions you will have your final outputs, and the final output will help you understand what's going on with your procedure. What do you need to do in the process of research? This is very important for you to understand which steps you should follow throughout your proposal. So, as you can see here, everything is kind of connected to each other, and you need to always think the output of your first step as the input of your second step and the following steps. So, first, what you need to do, you have to first find and also observe whether there's a problem or there's a question which you can hypothesize before you start any kind of procedure. So, there should be a question or problem in order for you to solve. And as being engineering candidates, you always need to start from scratch and go to the root of the problem and understand what you can do about this problem or how you can solve this in a series of actions. So you have, secondly, so throughout this procedure, you can talk to producers, consumers, policymakers, and also take some advice and understand their problems, and eventually specify your question. So secondly, you have to formulate your goals and objectives, because you can have some problems that needs to be solved, but in this process of actions, you need to have specific goals and objectives so that you can create your methodology. So the third step is creating your research design. What is this research design? It's when you plan and design what you're going to do during your experimentation. And these two should always be correlated because you need to always have a research design to target your main goals and objectives. Otherwise, it's going to be useless because you're not going to be able to test your hypothesis. So the third and second steps are always correlated with each other. The fourth step is generating research results. So as you can guess, this step is when you make experimentation, when you eventually have some solid data so that you can interpret them and understand whether you're investigating or reaching your targets, your goals and objectives with the help of these tests during the experimentation. The results are usually from some hands-on experiments in the lab or some survey that you conduct or some mathematical modeling, for instance, that you do, or getting some results from your simulation in your in a specific software, and also you need to generate those results. And the last step is, of course, interpretation and analysis of your results. That means, yes, you have your raw data and you have a lot of results, you have a lot of numbers. You need to understand whether these numbers specifically indicate something or not. You have to see if you come to some conclusions that you can convert your hypothesis into a thesis or a law or a theory, or if everything is not as you expected it to be, you need to go back to step number one. Or, of course, you can always go back to number 4 and understand if you have scientifically proven your experimentation results. So the process of research is very important, and that's what you need to do before you actually start doing your experiments. You have to do it before you start your project. So the first semester will be actually here. Your first semester will be in the first, second, and third steps, because you will plan everything, understand your methodology, and then you will start applying your methods in the second semester. Again, this is a similar graph or image of what you need to do. So you have to check the existing theories and observations. You have to develop a research question or hypothesis. You have to make some predictions so you can plan your research, and tests and new observations are needed to be done so that you can either confirm your existing theory or you can publish a new theory throughout your research question. And if everything goes well, then you can select among competing theories, and eventually your theory can even become a law. So during your research methods, you can do some specific data analysis. So you can check for already made data. You can make some surveys, ask questions, or self-report. You can always run tests, such as in experiments, and test everything in controlled environments so that you can know when you change one factor, you will understand the outcomes of that factor. And you can also always make some observations, such as watching, recording, trying to understand the missing point of this procedure. So, what you need to understand during your research process is which one would be the best research design and method for your own senior project. Everyone needs to tailor their own project methodology, otherwise you cannot be successful because we have so many different fields of engineering. So you need to understand your problem of interest, level of information needed, resources that you already have, your experience and similar things so that you can define the best research design for you. So you have completed your research design, you have already planned everything, and then it's the step for collecting data during your experimentation or other type of research. So what do we have? If we measure anything from any research study that we've mentioned previously, we collect data, and it's could be in large amounts, in small amounts, in a very standardized way, or in a very raw format. You need to be able to interpret and use this data in your final research methodology. In order to do that, statistics is a perfect tool to help you organize and interpret your data, because statistics can help you understand whether there are significant differences in your data or whether the data that you collected are the same type of data or different. So you will understand what the numbers are telling you. So during this, during the usage of this tool, statistics tool, you can use two different kinds of data. So quantitative or qualitative. The quantitative one is when you measure some naturally occurring data in numerical scale like age, temperature, and else. The qualitative ones are the ones that cannot be measured in a natural numerical scale. They are always classified into one of group of categories, such as in gender. You can never actually measure this in a numerical scale, or nationality. So while applying statistical tools, or while utilizing statistical tools, you should be very careful about identifying the type of data that you're using. If you're using quantitative data and you mention or you indicate that it's a qualitative one, you can never get correct results. So you need to understand what type of data you're dealing with. So you collect your data from a published source. This is one way of collecting them. You can design experiments and collect your data. You can make, as we mentioned previously in the research methodology, you can do some surveys or you can observe them during a procedure. So, as we mentioned, what was the first step during our research process? The first one was observing and understanding the problem. So the problem statement that you first have should also contain stating your hypothesis. So the statistical hypothesis is actually a decision-making process about a population which may or may not be true. What you would be trying to prove during your senior project is whether this hypothesis is true or not. And while doing this, you will take advantage of the statistical tools or take advantage of experimentation, running tests, or collecting survey data, or collecting some observational data or experimentational data. So this is what you need to follow. First of all, you need to have two types of hypotheses. the null and the alternative one. So the null one is symbolized by H0, and it states that there is no difference between a parameter and a specific value. So there's no difference between two parameters, but the alternative one should be exactly the opposite of the null hypothesis, and it's symbolized by H1. It also says that the existence of a different parameter between a parameter and a specific value or two different parameters is possible. So the H0 says there is no difference, the H1 says there is a difference. You need to understand which hypothesis, either H0 or H1, is applicable to your experimentation. So, through empirical testing, we can eventually say that we reject the hypothesis, so the data proved to be inconsistent with the inconsistent with the hypothesis. I'm sorry, or we fail to reject. So we say the data proved to be consistent with the hypothesis. It's very important, and we always have specific values that we can say the data is correct or not. So in order to collect our data, as we said, we can do some experiments, and we always follow the experimentation after stating our hypothesis, because we need to check the correctness of this specific hypothesis with the help of some data, and we can do this by collecting or doing some experimentation. So in a practical research project, the researcher's next step is designing experimental procedures. The research method in which conditions are controlled so that one or more independent variables can be manipulated to test a hypothesis about a dependent variable. So what do I mean by independent and dependent variables? The dependent variable will be, as you can guess from the name, dependent on the change in the independent variables, such as, let's say, the temperature of a specific growth media will be able to control the growth of a specific animal or microorganism or yeast. And you can say that at this point, the growth of the microorganism is the dependent variable, and the temperature of the environment is the independent variable, because the growth is dependent on the temperature change. It could be one independent variable or more than one. And it could be one dependent variable or more than one dependent variable. So this the choice of these variables allow you to evaluate causal relationships among variables. It's very important. So you can say that in order to reach your target value for the dependent variable, you can change the values or levels in your independent variable. And you should always control your all other variables so that you can understand which change is actually affecting your dependent variable. Okay. So more terms such as experimental treatments are alternative manipulations of the independent variable being investigated. The experimental groups, are groups of subjects exposed to the experimental treatment. Control group is when you use a group without any change in the independent variable, so they're not exposed to the experimental treatment. You can always use this as a blank and always compare what's happening with the change in different values of independent variables. So you can say that the control group is present and this control group represents the correctness of our experimental run. It's very important to use that. So in focus of this presentation, I'm not actually going to specifically explain pre-experimental designs. There are some to kind of eliminate some of the factors that you're going to deal with, but they're not very well defined. Therefore, these designs are not actually being used a lot. We usually use other kind of specific experimental designs, such as design of experiments, as we call here DOE. So this term is very important for you, specifically when you try to optimize a process, optimize the output of this specific process so that you can increase your, such as production yields. This is very important to use during your planning of experiments. So DOE helps you control changes to input variables in order to gain maximum amounts of information on cause and effect relationships with a minimum sample size. You decrease the number of experiments that you're going to conduct and increase the number of information that you're getting out of these experimentation. So you have two different aspects, design and statistical analysis, in order to perform DOE. And let's keep this in mind. Design Expert software is one of the very well-known ones in order to be able to apply those type of design of experiments. So they're simple comparative experiments, usually use t-tests or ANOVA, the analysis of variance, in order to compare the differences between groups and eventually statistically test your hypothesis. So again, during your DOE, you design the experiment, collect your data, apply statistical analysis, and conclude. You can either make recommendations or you can say that this system can be optimized with the change in these input variables. Why is the DOE so important? So that I suggest you to apply during your senior project, because you can easily learn about the process that you're being investigated. You can screen important variables. You can eventually build a mathematical model so that you will be able to use this model for your further applications, even though you don't have the data during your experimental procedure, because you apply this model with the help of a set of experiments from your planning, and this model is fitting to your results during your experimentation, so that it's very useful for utilizing this for further applications, even though you don't necessarily apply the specific type of experimentation. What is also really important again is obtaining prediction equations so that you can optimize your design. So all of these are actually very important. And if required, eventually you can optimize your design. What happens if you optimize your design? Of course, you can reach maximum yields or whatever you want to reach. So during statistical design of experimentation, you need to perform some specific steps, such as replication. You can estimate your experimental error. So you have to apply more than one experiment so that you minimize the noise. You need to do randomization, so you need to randomly choose your type of experimental results so that you minimize potential uncontrollable biases because it's a homogeneous resulting or reporting. Or you can do blocking so that you can increase the precision of an experiment. That means if you do blocking, you apply the same type of experimentation in different time intervals. So if you can receive the same type of results in all of those from all of those blocks, you can say that you controllably applied or demonstrated the same data at the end of your experimentation. So how can we apply this DOE in engineering design? So in different types of it's actually it's actually applicable to very different fields of engineering. In order to evaluate and compare basic design configurations, evaluate different materials, different levels or concentrations of the application of these materials to a specific experimentation, in order to select design parameters so that your design will work very well under a variety of conditions and you can eventually have a robust design. And you can also use this to determine key design parameters. So again, you will understand the impact of different parameters and reach a very high yield or productivity. So there are actually so many different applications of DOE, but today I will try to explain just very briefly, but you can always ask me questions, send me an email, or you can get use of the references or books that I would recommend at the end of this presentation in order to obtain further information regarding these approaches. But the major ones that we usually use is factorial design, response surface methodology, and Taguchi method. So all of these designs can be combined together or can be used with consequently. So first design, the factorial one. What is the factorial design? Usually it's used to examine the effects that the manipulation of at least two independent variables and at simultaneously at different levels. So your independent variables should be at least two, and you would have two or three levels of these factors. So we also call the independent variables as factors. Then you also see the impact that each of these independent variables has on the dependent variable, and we call it as the main effect. The main effect of each independent variable is very important for you because if it's a significant effect, you can decide to change the levels of this specific independent variable, or if it only gives you an insignificant effect, you can choose to remove this from your process. This is very important. And also, when we are looking at each independent variable separately, we call it as the main effect. But if we want to see the different effects of different variables at the same time, because when we apply these independent variables to the process simultaneously again, We can also have the interaction effect because together they can have a synergy and have different effects, but one by one they would have separate effects. So we can check the main effect or interaction effect. So that was the factorial design, and the factorial design is actually usually in two levels. So you don't necessarily understand the effect of different levels. You usually just check or screen whether the independent variable has some specific effects on the dependent variable. But if you want to have a further, if you want to have further information and optimize your project, optimize your process, you can continue with this response surface methodology. It's a very perfect tool to easily optimize and understand the modeling or obtain a model with a very few number of runs, and eventually you can maximize, minimize, or get to a specific target. As you can see here, you have a response surface, so you fill the surface with your responses towards your factors, and with the help of this surface you can understand whether your factors have a high effect on the final response, such as yield, so whether it increases or decreases the yield. So you just get the response in a surface layer. Under response surface methodologies, the most common ones are Wilson and Box-Banken designs, and usually we also call it as the central composite design. The main difference is on the factorial center and axial points. So as you can see here, we have an extra factorial points in here, but we have the interactions in the middle for Box-Banken design, and we don't have the lowest or the highest levels. So this is what changes our final results, whether we use the axial points or we have the factorial points which differ by 1, and we always have the central point. So what these points mean is they give us the number of experimentations or the number of runs that we will conduct. So as you can see here, a design example of aerosum looks like this. So this, we could have the central points at the same time, or the axial points, and eventually we will have the response. And as you can see here, it's an 18 run experimentation with different combinations of our independent variables. So these are the independent variables, and this is the dependent variable, as we call the response. So the independent variables have different levels in each run, and each response at the end of this, each response eventually will give us a model which we can use to optimize the process. So what's different is the number of factors depending on Wilson and Box-Banken will give you different number of runs because of the presence of center points, because of the differences in the presence of center points, axial points, and factorial points. So when we use the RSM, we can determine the factor levels and their interactions, optimum combination of factors. So what is most important is we can understand how a specific response is affected by changes. So that means the changes are given to us with the differences in the levels of the independent variables. So what could be the different levels? For instance, if your independent variable is the temperature, different levels could be 20 degrees, 25 degrees, and 30 degrees. So we can understand the growth in different temperatures, and with the help of the RSM, we can see if, let's say, 25 degrees will give us a higher growth, or 30 degrees will give us a higher growth. And we can do it at the same time simultaneously to more than 3 different independent variables. You eventually achieve a quantitative understanding and robust condition, and have a very simpler second order regression model that you can use for further optimization. So we've talked about the factorial design, talked about the Box-Banken design. Now the last design that I want to talk to you is the Taguchi method, which is a very popular one, specifically, especially for the engineers in industrial engineering, or genetics and bioengineering, or biomedical engineering. This is a design that is specifically used to determine the best combination of inputs to produce a product or service. So if you want to reach the best results, you can use the Taguchi method, because with a very few number of experiments, you can get a very high number of information data. So it gives you a robust design. It can give you concept design, a parameter design, or a tolerance design. So what do I mean by that? Robust, eventually you will have a very standardized design, so you will always have the same results from the same process. You can always have a concept design so that you can reach a specific target. You can have the parameter design so you can understand the different effects on different type of parameters, which we usually use for screening. Or you can have a tolerance design so that you can understand the limits of your process. This was first introduced by Dr. Taguchi, that's why it's called as Taguchi, in the Bell laboratories. So it helps us determine the functional relationship between controllable or product service design factors, and also you understand, you receive a method to optimize your controllable variables. You have a procedure for examining the relationship between random noise in the process and product or service variability. That means whether you have a significant difference depending to noise. So that means an unexpected, uncontrollable, and unstandardized result, or whether it's from this, or whether it's from really from the result of your independent variable. So depending on so when we compare all these approaches from DOE, let's say you have your research question, you want to understand which type of design you should use. So let's say you only have one factor, which one you should use? When you have one factor, you can use completely randomized block design, which is a type of factorial design. This is very straightforward because you only have one number of factors, and you can apply different concentrations as much as you like, because you will only have one parameter to deal with. This is easy. So, but I don't think having only one factor is a good choice for planning a good experimentation. You would usually have 2 to 4 factors. You can even have 5 or more, but you would usually have 2 to 4. Which ones you can use? If you want to compare your independent variables, you can use randomized block design. It's a good way. Or you can screen them. The screening is usually good when you have 5 or more, and which you can use is fractional factorial or Plackett-Berman design. This is similar to Taguchi design as well, because Taguchi is also a type of factorial design. Um, um, it's also called as an orthogonal array. Or if you have 2 to 4, you can use full or fractional factorial designs. When you pass the screening stage, if you want to do the response surface methodology, you can always use Box-Banken or central composite design, and you usually use this for optimizing your procedure. If you have 5 or more, you actually first have to decrease the number of factors you have so that you can apply these, because these can only be applied between 2 to 4. Considering you have more than 3 levels of each factor, it's not a good idea to apply this to 5 or more factors, because you would have a really high number of experiments. So if you want to decrease the number of experiments that you have, or the number of factors that you have, you can start by screening and by these designs. Then you can go into detail, and you can also use these systems, or Taguchi for instance, to optimize your system. So let's sum up what we've been talking about. When you have your research question, and when you want to plan what you're going to do, and eventually you would receive results, and the experiments will help you with acquiring these results. Eventually you would come to a conclusion, and you would tell us whether your project was, or whether your hypothesis was accepted or not. So you start with your questioning. You select a dependent variable, which we also call as a response. This will provide information about your problem. Then you select the independent variables that are connected to those. And the number of levels of these independent variables can be chosen from some research data that you acquire from the literature. The literature review will help you understand the levels of your independent variables. Then remember the table that I've showed you previously. You can use that table, or you can use the software such as Design Expert to choose the appropriate experimental design. Try to choose a simple design and analysis method to have a simpler way of experimentation. So you've chosen your design. You have to continue with performing your experiments. The step is also called collecting the data, and you always have to be very careful about randomization, replication, or whether you need to have a blocking or not. You have to be able to understand this, and the experimental environments should be as uniform as possible, so that you would always have the same type of environmental conditions, and the differences in your results will only be because of your independent variables, not because of any random noise. This is very important to always acquire, or to always provide uniform experimental conditions. Then what you need to do is collecting all these data and analyze your data, and check the model accuracy by validating underlying assumptions associated with the model. You sometimes have to conduct some final validation experimentation so that you can understand specifically whether your model is working or not. And eventually, you need to draw some conclusions and inferences about the results, so that you can eventually interpret the physical meaning of these results. You can say whether your null hypothesis was rejected or accepted. You can say whether your experiments were collected or conducted in a uniform way, so your data is reliable, and your final results are optimized so that the practical significance of your findings are actual and important. So, to sum up, let's go through all of these steps together. So, what are we doing during the research process? We start with recognition of and statement of the problem. So, we just figure out what the problem is. This is very important. Again, as being engineers, we have to go to the root of the problem so that we can solve it. Choose our factors, levels, ranges, and responses. Then secondly, we have to continue with the choice of experimental design, as I said, depending on the sample size, replicates, also the number of factors that we have. So at this stage, you can use the Design Expert software, which is one of the very popular ones. Then after acquiring the algorithm for our experimentation, we have to perform our experiments. Then continue with the statistical analysis of our data, because it's very important nowadays, specifically when you're applying for a grant or when you're applying or when you're submitting a paper. The reviewers always ask you to show the statistical significance of your data. Please always be able to use some graphics or apply ANOVA so that you can tell the significant differences between your groups. And eventually, when you have this data, come to some conclusions and give recommendations so that you can say that your hypothesis was correct or your hypothesis was not correct. It could be optimized so that you go back to a previous step or two previous steps and try to realize or try to improve your hypothesis with more experimentation. So, what you need to keep in mind. First of all, you have to start with a non-statistical knowledge of the problem. That means some background knowledge. Always keep the design and analysis as simple as possible. So, you know what they say, keep it simple, stupid. This is a very well-known phrase when we need to apply specific physical experimentation, especially. Always try to keep it simple, but always use uniform experimentation. Never use very complex, sophisticated statistical techniques. Just go with the t-testing or ANOVA. They always work. If the design is good, analysis would be relatively straightforward and you have good results. But if it's bad, you can never have good statistical results from a bad design, because you don't know whether your experiments demonstrate the right kind of data or results. And always recognize the difference between practical and statistical significance. Your data could give you a statistically significant result, and your hypothesis could your results could show that your hypothesis was correct, but this could not be the situation, because the statistical significance is not the same thing as the practical significance. You always used to utilize some brain here, so you need to be able to interpret your results so that you can understand whether the statistical significance really represents the practical one as well. And you have to understand that your experiments are usually iterative. That means they follow a certain path, and it's not wise to design a comprehensive experiment. At the start of the study, you should start with very small steps and then get complicated ones. And you need to understand whether you need to make some modifications throughout your procedure. It's always wise to use a sequential approach, and never invest more than 25 of your resources in the initial design, because you might need to always redesign your initial steps, considering you're not experienced enough regarding that specific process. So always use your initial design as a learning experience so that you can improve it better. So thanks for listening to me. These are my references, and please um, never hesitate to ask me any questions or make comments. You can send me an email through this, or you can send me an email through Oasis. I hope all your senior projects will result in a good thesis data, and you will eventually come up with maybe laws or theories so that your research questions would be solved and answered in a statistical manner. So again, thank you for listening. Good luck to everyone.